Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. Since I've been kind of in the art convention grind in terms of making merch for the last few months or so, I've been getting a few comments here and there and questions regarding about how quickly I can draw so many things with a fairly short turnaround time. So I'm going to share with you a few tips and tricks as well as habits that I have that kind of like help quicken my process. So kind of the biggest thing, or one of the most useful things for myself, is that I like having shortcuts mapped to a device to kind of have it help me reduce the amount of times that I spend kind of darting around on my tablet as well as on the canvas, opening up menus, selecting options, changing brush sizes, etc. So even though a keyboard is nice, I was fortunate enough to have received the Tourbox Elite that was sent to me by Tourbox, and I've kind of used several of their models in the past, and I'm still currently using the Tourbox Lite whenever I'm using Clip Studio Paint or Paint Tool Cide on the desktop. So if you're not familiar with this device, it basically allows you to map and create your own personal shortcut settings for your desired program. It has many presets for different programs as well. It has very tactile knobs, it has a wheel, it has buttons, and it makes the device very intuitive to use and simple to learn. Also, it does have haptic feedback that provides a more kind of like immersive and tactile experience for control. So unlike a keyboard, you can map multiple keys to a singular button, or if you prefer, you can map like certain actions to something more tactile. So for me, I like changing the brush size by turning the knob. You can also use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out, or the wheel at the very bottom to rotate your canvas. You can also pair these up with a button to kind of further the customization for your preferences. I like to use the knob alongside with a button to change my brush density, so I don't really have to dart around on the side of my menu to switch between the sensitivity and the brush size. I would oftentimes use this, especially when I'm doing any kind of digital painting on Paint Tool Cide or Clip Studio Paint. So I would use the knob on its own to change the brush size, and I don't have to pick like very select preset brush sizes from the menu. And then if I'm holding down a specific button alongside with the knob, I can change the density and paint a little bit more easier, and it just makes my process a lot faster because I don't have to keep reaching over to the menu to keep switching settings because I switch it so often. So you can actually set this up with the iPad. So I decided to work on a little drawing of Finon, and I found it much easier to paint as I didn't really need to constantly click on the tiny little menus to change my brush size or density. So on my iPad, especially due to the size, I find that the interface sometimes does feel a little bit more crowded, but I like using the studio mode because I have access to absolutely everything that is the same on my desktop, but I don't really use it as much as I would like to because my lack of screen space does make it a little bit harder to use. But with the Tourbox, I can actually hide a lot of the menus, which helps me increase the amount of drawing real estate that I will have on my iPad. So other than shortcuts, my second biggest tip I would recommend is keeping things consistent if you're working on similarly formatted art. So in this case, when I work on chibis, I tend to keep the brush size the same, a similar color palette, and all my layers are in the exact same order pretty much. But with that being said, if you are no rush, then there's not really a reason for you to adhere to these. But I do find that if you spend less time having to think about making certain decisions, you can definitely let your brain go into a bit of an autopilot and work a bit faster without those weird pauses. So luckily the Tourbox Elite is also compatible with the iPad like I mentioned earlier, which is great so that I can actually keep using the same shortcuts on my desktop version by having it connect via the Bluetooth to my iPad as well. So I can kind of keep all my settings very consistent, and I can switch between the two if I ever need to transfer a file and work on my desktop, or if I'm going out and about and I need to switch over to my iPad. So that way I can keep all my settings pretty much the same. A lot of that muscle memory will start to kick in, and a lot of my habits and familiarity can kind of take over, and we can continue to work on the go. I did find that it was easier to adjust to Clip Studio Paint on the iPad, and I was a little bit less concerned with the tiny space since I have most of my settings mapped the same way, like I said, to kind of keep things consistent. But I can't be the only one who struggled with the amount of real estate when it comes to working on Clip Studio Paint's studio mode on the iPad. Things do get a little bit cluttered, but I often finding myself closing and opening windows all the time, so having shortcuts just makes things a little bit easier, and then having those shortcuts being consistent consistent across your devices also makes things a little bit faster. So while working on the chibis, my workflow is pretty much the same as working on the desktop. All of my settings were pretty much the same. If you ever get confused or forget your settings, Tourbox actually has a real-time HUD that allows you to see your selected commands just in case. It was very easy to map out all of my actions to see what was the most comfortable while drawing. Not everyone's habits and preferences are the same, so always feel free to adjust to your own needs. I did notice that while I was working on Procreate that all of my settings on the Tourbox actually worked really well. I do wish in the future though that Procreate will actually have a pan option that is not only the 2-finger swipe. I'm kind of mentioning this because in Procreate they don't really have like a pan option that people might use similarly to using the spacebar in other programs, so I can't really map the panning onto the Tourbox, or at least I couldn't find a way to do it. And panning is one of the most useful tools that I used that is for my non-dominant hand. But let's kind of talk about our last little tip, because this one's a very flexible one and it differs from person to person quite drastically, I guess. So personally, I like having deadlines for projects to kind of keep myself accountable. Now, with that being said, I don't think that it's necessary for everyone or not for every project that you do. But self-imposed deadlines are good if you tend to slow down or find yourself not finishing pieces. But like I said, this depends on like the person. I like a bit of pressure to push myself to finish things and move on, but some people might find that more intimidating and actually make yourself stop drawing. So you know yourself best, so do whatever works the best for yourself. So let's go ahead and go back a little bit and I will kind of show you guys a little bit of time lapses of different portions of me drawing from this session, because I ended up just testing out the Tourbox throughout different illustrations and through, I guess, Procreate and Clip Studio Paint. So I worked on a little bit of Reimu, and that one was already a piece I was working on and off while doing convention prep to let my brain reset a little bit here and there. But I was just kind of testing out whether or not like the pan works or like what tools I could really map to the Tourbox while working on it, just to see what felt the most natural. Because the thing I would not recommend if you are very new at just using shortcuts in general is that you're strictly adhering to someone else's shortcuts. I know there's like very basic shortcuts like Control Z is undo, Control Y typically is redo, holding the spacebar is like panning, but kind of curating your own shortcuts I think is very useful, and it helps you remember your own stuff a little bit easier. Especially with the Tourbox, because it's so tactile, everyone has their own habits, different hand sizes, whatever, so just do whatever's the most comfortable, and you can find like the combinations that you think is, I guess, the most natural for yourself that you'll constantly use over and over, and I'm sure because of that, it'll help you develop that habit a little bit quicker. So for the second session, I ended up drawing, I think, Thynon very briefly in Clip Studio Paint. Now, I ended up drawing him twice, but I scrapped the first drawing. For some reason, I was just not having it that day. And unfortunately, not every day is going to be like a super productive art day. And I feel like as long as you're not following a very strict deadline that's like imposed maybe by a different party, not like yourself, give yourself a little bit of leeway and have like break days or just like break time within your drawing day or drawing session so that you don't feel too bogged down or feel too tied to a piece, if that makes sense. Because sometimes that added pressure to having to always finish a piece is more detrimental than not just wanting to finish the piece by your own volition, if that makes sense. So I ended up scrapping, so delete your art every so often. There's no need to like see a piece from start to finish every time. Sometimes it's just quicker to restart and just not need to hate your own drawing for like a long period of time. So sketching Thynon was actually pretty fun. I was just having fun playing around with the brushes, and I like the sensitivity on the iPad for certain brushes compared to using them on the desktop version. I'm sure it's because like, you know, different tablet versus different pressure sensitivity. It could be also like the pencil nib or whatever in comparison. So it was just nice to see the difference, because there's some pens or like brushes like the Jing sketches brush pack that I downloaded from the Photoshop version into Clip Studio Paint actually works very similarly to the ones in Procreate when I'm working on the iPad, but I feel like there's a slight distinction when I'm working on the desktop version for Clip Studio Paint, that the brushes do behave a little bit different. So it's either my pressure sensitivity, or I need to tweak a different setting, or just something to do with my tablet, I think. But for the last session that I ended up doing was more chibis. So I'll insert some other clips. I believe probably before this video comes out, I would have released maybe 2 vlogs showing a bit more behind the scenes process of doing convention prep. So I think part 1, I did majority of drawing, which very similarly enough, when I was working on the Anaxa chibi, his kind of workflow for myself was the exact same as I would drawing on the desktop version, which is great because I didn't really have to think too much about trying to readjust to almost feels like a new program, even though it's not. So to kind of summarize the 3 main points, I guess I kind of focus on when it comes to speeding up my art process is number 1, is shortcuts. Now, I mostly mentioned like digital device shortcuts, which I highly recommend just because it truly is something that can help you speed things up kind of like almost physically because you're going to be limited towards like how much movement you can do with your hands, but other things could be like other tools within a program that could have shortcuts. I know Clip Studio Paint has quite a bit as well. And I guess like there's a little bit less for like traditional art, but I'm sure there's like, you know, small little shortcuts or like hacks that you could definitely do to help speed up the process. And whatever you can use, just use it. As long as it doesn't really hurt anyone in the process, I think that's pretty much okay. So my second main point was consistency. So consistency kind of revolves around the idea of familiarity and habit making, I would say. So for me, I like keeping things very similar if I want to speed up the process because a lot of my like physical muscle memory will kick in and there's a lot less processing time for my brain trying to make decisions. So cutting out all of those like little pauses of being like, oh, maybe I should do this instead of like knowing that I should do it, if that makes sense. Because if I'm going to make like, let's say Honkai Star Rail, which ended up being 69 chibis, if I'm doing it 69 times basically, I don't want to have a different decision for every step of the way for each individual chibi. I knock out my layer order, I knock out the brush that I'm going to be using. I kind of limit it towards like 2 brushes, one for line art and one for coloring. I have color palettes set out for majority of the characters already, stylized the eyes in a very particular way, doing my line art in a very particular way, just for, I guess like, because it's faster for me, because it's already having decisions already done, but also habits because I don't have to do a lot of thinking. But also, the consistency across my chibis is that they all also look the same. So this works really well if you want to have like a very consistent look for certain things. But the downside or like the caveat for this is the fact that if you are planning on trying to do something new to help improve or like to, I don't explore or change, then definitely let yourself have that ability to do whatever and not follow such a strict regimen for your drawing, because that does give a little bit more of like a stagnant kind of feeling towards your drawing, so it doesn't give you a lot of room for growth. But it's great for if you're trying to churn out a bunch of drawings for consistency's sake, or you just have like a large batch to do. I do recommend doing that. And I guess for like digital painting wise, I still follow like the similar steps where I will have a colored background of like a certain color. I will choose the same brush for sketching. I will set my layers up in the same way. So having a duplicate layer for my sketch and then changing one other sketch to be multiply, adding my colors underneath, and then eventually merging them and then rendering and cleaning up. So it's like process of kind of things that are going to be the same throughout everything, but being still open to allowing myself to experiment or change things up if I need to or just feel like it. But like I said, if it's for the fact that you're trying to churn out many drawings, then consistency and habits definitely help a lot. On a smaller note, I would also recommend trying to optimize your layout or your drawing space if you can. So if you know you have more frequently used items on the right hand side because you're right-handed, I would keep them there. Or if you have things that are a little bit more cluttered on, you know, the side that you're working on, that's probably not very ideal. So you can kind of prevent yourself from hopping around too much, as well as having anything that you use frequently as close by as possible. Then the last tip I recommended was the idea of having some sort of schedule or plan. So, or I guess like it was more like deadlines, I guess. So for me, like I mentioned, if I don't really set out a goal, a deadline, or a plan of any sort for drawing, then that drawing can either go on forever or it will never even start. So if it never even starts, we're gonna have a long process to even get to the finish line. Or if I don't have a set plan for like a look for the drawing, or I don't have a deadline or a schedule for it, then I could potentially work on a piece and overwork it for a very long time just for me to hate it or for me to never ever finish it. So it's like, kind of prioritize time if you can. And like I mentioned throughout earlier this video, is that you know yourself best. So if you're the type to procrastinate, try to find realistic goals for yourself that will help you align with what you want to have finished by your set time frame, if that makes sense. Other smaller little habits or things that I like to do is just like general planning stuff. So if I'm drawing a bunch of characters, let's say for fan art for Genshin Impact, I will try my best to get all the references that I will need for every character and have it consistently laid out. So for Genshin, I would have the kind of model reference along with their official art and have that for each character so that I don't have to go and flip through either my phone looking for photo references that I've either taken screenshots of or saved images of, or having to go into Google and finding new images as well. So I think this is where I'm going to leave you guys with today's video. Apologies that today's video is on the shorter side and that we are going to have very inconsistent uploads this week until I get back next week probably, or at least halfway through next week, because I might have to get over some jet lag, unfortunately. But thank you again to Tourbox for sending me their Tourbox Elite Plus for me to try out. So if you guys are looking for a tool to help with like shortcuts, mapping, or just speeding up your process, and you work with digital tools, let's say like a tablet or even the iPad, highly recommend checking out the Tourbox Elite Plus or any of their other Tourbox models, because it's very helpful. I think it's very easy to learn, and at this point, whenever I draw on especially my desktop, I always will gravitate towards using the Tourbox because of its size, the portability, and like the endless possibilities of combinations that I can do for shortcuts. So I will talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!